Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT patch rundown video. Today we'll be diving into the newest patch 11.12. Once again, we have another massive patch that alters fundamental parts of the game as a whole. There's plenty to cover between trait, item, and champion changes alongside new and altered systems. Let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we get into the balance adjustments, let's begin by going over all the system changes. Up first are changes to loot orbs. They've reintroduced two consumables into the loot table that we saw in set 4. Those items are Reforger and Magnetic Remover. Reforger does what the name implies, it rerolls an item. Remover can be used to pop items off of a champion. Both consumables were well received in set 4, so it's not a surprise to see them added again in set 5. What is a bit surprising is the timing. With the meta constantly being drastically changed every patch, adding in new consumables is a bit much. That said, they are well-designed consumables. The frequency that they appear in the game is unknown, as they are just listed as rare drops from loot orbs. Hopefully this means they won't replace existing drops and are instead in addition to things like components and gold. Next are quite a lot of changes to the armory. For starters, the 3-2 armory now gives one shadow component and one regular component. Honestly, this should have been in the game from the get-go, so it's nice to see them make this adjustment. The 4-2 armory, on the other hand, is being removed, though when they say removed, it's not entirely, as there is now a chance for armories to appear starting on the second round of each stage from 4 onwards. The chance for this happening isn't specified, so it may happen frequently or rarely. Only playtesting will determine this. Basically, these new armories are special. Instead of just having components, they can also have consumables, spatulas, full items, and emblems. That's a wide variety of potential drops, which adds in even more variance to the game. In addition to that, the later the game goes, the more powerful these drops are. From stage 6 on, there will no longer be components from the armories, with the emblems being based off of your current board. Overall, there's a lot to unpack from the armory changes. Whether they end up being good for the game or not, time will tell. The main issue is, again, timing. We've barely had any time to breathe in the meta, and now they've introduced even more changes. Not only are the changes somewhat questionable, such as the reintroduction of a poorly received consumable from set 4, Loaded Dice. Changes can be good, but maybe they need to slow down the rate just a bit. And the last system change is the critical strike damage. They've reduced the base damage from 150% to 130%. This means every champion has had their damage reduced. It's a fairly substantial change to the game and nerfs damage across the board, not just from champions' baseline, but in conjunction with percent-based items like Jeweled Gauntlet and Infinity Edge. We'll likely see future balance changes making adjustments to this change. Let's move on to the trait changes. Before we touch on the actual balance changes, we want to acknowledge they've added new tiers to several synergies. Dragon Slayer, Ironclad, Renewer, Revenant, Spellweaver, and Skirmisher now have one additional tier that adds more power to the trait. We recommend checking out the patch notes to see what each new tier is adding. On to balance changes, beginning with Cavalier. Cavalier already suffered a nerf in the 11.11b patch, so naturally that means they must be nerfed again. The damage reduction is going from 20-30-35% to 20-25-30%. It's a common theme this set to nerf frontline strategies and champions, so at least they're being consistent. Abomination took over the meta in 11.11 as it became one of the most common opening boards during stage 2 and 3. Most of these new changes are nerfed, but they are compensating, so overall the monstrosity should still be viable. First of those nerfs is the monstrosity stops charging after slamming into 2 targets. Arguably, this may be considered a buff in certain situations, but more often than not it's a nerf, as the monstrosity will no longer fully charge into the enemy backline if they position well. Counterplay is good, so this is a welcome change. Next, the attack damage is going down to 90, 150, 200 from 100, 160, 220. In addition to that, the bonus AD is down to 9, 15, 20 from 10, 16, 22. Basically, the monstrosity won't hit as hard. But don't fret, as they've made it so that when they cast their ability, it will now remove attack speed slows and AD reduction. The last change, a buff, increases the armor and magic resist of the monstrosity to 40, 60, 75 from 40, 50, 60. This overall means the monstrosity will hit for less, but should be more tanky. Most importantly, they'll be adding a bit of positioning counterplay when playing against the Abomination. Next, we have a minor buff to Dawnbringer, as the bonus damage is going to 12% from 10%. The theme of Dawnbringers is that they heal, so buffing the damage increase is kinda whatever. But hey, the buff is a buff. Redeem is having the stats of armor, magic resistance, and ability power bumped up to 30, 60, 90 from 30, 50, 70. Basically, it makes them stronger as a chase trait, but the likelihood of hitting 9 redeemed is rather rare, so this change doesn't do much in the grand scheme of things. Lastly, skirmishers are getting a minor buff to their first tier as the max health shield is going from 20% to 25%. Not much, but may help introduce skirmishers back into the early game. With traits done, let's move on to champion changes. There's a lot to talk about, so we'll try to stick to the more relevant changes. First up, we've got buff to Lysandra as her damage is going up to 280, 330, 450 for the primary damage, and the secondary damage is up to 140, 165, 225. Sure, Lysandra was a bit weak at level 1 and 2, but buffing her damage as a 3-star unit is a slippery slope. More than likely, we will see the return of Lysandra reroll simply as a reaction to these buffs. Hopefully, it's not as powerful as it was previously. Vayne is also being buffed, though only at level 1 and 2, as her passive true damage is going from 6590 to 7100. Less scary than the Lysandra buff, but enough to make Vayne potentially usable in the early game. Alongside the Cavalier nerfs, Hecarim is having his overall healing and damage reduced. The damage is going from 450, 600, 1200 to 250, 350, 500, and the healing to 250, 350, 500 from 300, 400, 800. Fairly drastic nerfs, definitely pointing towards them not wanting reroll Cavaliers to be viable. On the plus side, they finally fixed Hecarim to properly scale with ability power, so who knows, maybe these nerfs won't be as bad as they look. LeBlanc once again gets slapped by the nerf bat with her damage going down to 100, 150, 250 from 200, 250, 500. At this point, it feels like they should just remove LeBlanc since they've had to constantly adjust her every single patch. To compensate for this loss in damage, they've altered her stun to now be 1.5 to 2.5 seconds, and her health has gone up to 600 from 550. Nautilus has been rather lackluster so far, and mostly gets used as a trait bot for Ironclad, so they're buffing his attack damage to 80 from 65, which really won't make a difference. More importantly, his abilities damage is going up to 200, 300, 750, from 150, 250, 700, so all in all, he will hit harder, which should increase his early game value. Riven has finally become a real champion in the meta, so that must mean it's time for them to nerf her. For starters, her baseline attack damage is going down to 85 from 90. The second nerf is to her ability's attack damage bonus at tier 3 as it's going from 150% to 130%. Not the most disruptive of changes, but enough to question whether Riven is a viable late game carry or not. She'll still be plenty strong as an early game item holder, but players may reconsider re-rolling for her later. Next, they've made it so that Zyra will cast more often, but do less damage per cast. Her mana is going from 6120 to 4100, so the time to cast initially is roughly the same, but the next cast will be quicker. The damage is going down to 200, 325 from 250, 350, so not too much of a decrease. Overall, good changes. Jax fell off fairly hard after all of the skirmisher nerfs, so they're buffing him, with his ability's bonus attack speed going up to 30, 35, 100% from 20, 25, 60%. This is a much needed buff, though the viability of skirmishers is still in question. Karma is receiving several changes to help retool the way she functions. For starters, she now has a 1.5 second mana lock, which puts her in line with a lot of other champions that must attack once in between casts with blue buff. Furthering this, they reduced her mana to 50 from 60, and the mana reduction per cast to 15, 15, 30 from 20, 20, 40. Doing this allows him to buff her ability's damage, which is now 240, 300, 700 from 200, 250, 600. Honestly, it's hard to say how all this will shape up for Karma, but at least they've made it possible to tweak her damage output and tied her a bit less to blue buff. Normally we'd skip talking about this, but Vel'Koz is going up to 0.75 attack speed from 0.65. It's a fairly large increase, meaning items like Shojin or even Rageblade will scale better on him. Maybe not exactly what Vel'Koz needed to be viable in the meta, but an interesting change nonetheless. Lastly, Kayle is getting slapped with the nerf bat again, as her third ascension is going from 7 attacks for immunity to 10. Generally, Kayle has a Rageblade or other attack speed, so 3 additional attacks isn't too massive, but still, they keep nerfing her. At this point, it's worth asking the question as to whether it's even worth playing Kayle ever. And with that, we can now switch over to the last section of balance, item changes. Both variations of Archangel Staff are being buffed again this patch, with the regular version's mana ratio going from 40% to 45%. The Shadow item mana ratio is now 400% from 350%. At the rate at which they're buffing these two items, it's likely we'll see them appear in the meta at some point. Are these buffs enough to cause that? We'll have to wait and see, but if these two items aren't being played this patch, then the next round of buffs should be enough. Bloodthirster and Riskthirster are both receiving changes, with the regular item having its lifesteal reduced to 33% from 40%. The shadow item is losing a bit of the negative to using it, with the self-damage down to 25% of max health from 33%. While it's nice to see them reduce the penalty of using Riskthirster, at the end of the day, the difference in these two items still comes down to survivability. The shield from Bloodthirster is far more useful than the attack speed from the shadow variation, especially since most champions using these two items already gain attack speed elsewhere. Still, this is a good change to Riskthirster, as it does increase its value. Next up, Hand of Justice finally gets a buff to the damage and ability power, going up to 45 from 40. This is a welcome buff, as the item hasn't been relevant for quite some time. Another rarely used item being buffed is Ionic Spark, with its magic resist shred going to 50% from 40%. It's surprising this wasn't done in the last patch when they did a sweep over other forms of resistance shredding. Necessary buff, but it may still need more in future patches. Sacrificial Gauntlet is being changed from 15% of max health per cast to 100% of max mana multiplied by star level. Basically, more damage to champions with higher mana pools and less damage to spammy champions like Brand or Karma. Overall, a good change. Lastly, Titan's Revenge is going from 25% of pre-mitigation damage taken over to 20%. We've seen the power of this item on hard-to-kill champions like Hecarim last patch, though it's not like it's overpowered, so nerfing it does feel a bit odd. With Hecarim being nerfed, we may not even see this item ever made. Alright, that's all for balance adjustments. Before we go, there's a few bug fixes to talk about. First off, Brand. Brand had a bug where his cast would count twice for on-cast effects like Archangels and Shadow Jeweled Gauntlet. Good timing on this, considering both items are now better for Brand, so there won't be any more abusing this bug in 11-12. A very welcome bug fix is to Vel'Koz, as he will no longer get stuck on a target that's reviving. This has plagued Vel'Koz players since day one, so rejoice as he no longer continues lasering a champion going through the resurrect animation. And lastly, units should no longer attempt to chase Kennen while he dashes away. This one is also welcome and hopefully means they'll also look into fixing Syndra and Wolf. Syndra was already adjusted for this, but units will still chase after the unit she throws, and Wolf acts similarly to Kennen. Still, fixing Kennen is certainly a step in the right direction. And that's going to be it for today's video, folks. We recommend reading the patch notes to get a full list of the changes. It also helps to keep patch notes open during your games to double check the changes, especially for patches with tons of changes like this one. Let us know in the comment section below what change you're the most excited for. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.